Hello, YouTube. Comrades here. I would like to respond to an excellent video that I just watched, put out by a YouTuber that goes by the name of Cuck Philosophy. I actually found this channel by looking at a video on Jordan Peterson and how he mixes up Post-Modernism and Marxism. And I think that video is entirely spot on. I think this video makes some really great points and fleshes out a concept, social constructionism, that a lot of people misinterpret. And really, my video is not so much a rebuttal to Cuck Philosophy's video as much as it fleshes out further another point of divergence or distinction between a postmodern, I think what would generally be considered to be a postmodern concept like social construction, and where Marxism and historical materialism would deviate somewhat from this. And this just goes to reinforce how little Jordan Peterson understands about these two philosophies, if he is going to constantly conflate them or even just say that one has influenced the other. I mean, in a trivial sense, that's true, of course, but as far as there being any real thread of continuity between the two viewpoints, I have a hard time finding any. So his kind of conspiracy theory that that Orthodox Marxists became cultural Marxists slash postmodernists, I really have a hard time seeing. To me, it looks more like academia has, to the extent that it has become quote unquote cultural Marxist or postmodernist, whatever those terms mean. To me, that looks like an attack on Orthodox Marxism and historical materialism. It doesn't warm the cockles of my heart as a Marxist to see that happening to the extent that it actually is happening. I think Jordan Peterson overstates that case somewhat. As far as I don't really think postmodernism or cultural Marxism are as prevalent in academia as he seems to think. Perhaps on a few select campuses they happen to be. But anyways, that's beside the point. What I want to do is explain one further point of divergence between Marxism and this concept of social construction. And in particular, Cuck Philosophy's video made the very good point that our societies are often wrong about the sorts of things that they consider natural or eternal. You know, people thought that slavery was an inherent and essential part of human society. They thought things would always be that way. And of course, they turned out to be wrong. We know now that society can function and can run even without slavery. So in a sense, slavery was an elected choice that societies in the past made that they didn't have to make. And now we have chosen otherwise, and we no longer have slavery. I think that's the implication of Cuck Philosophy's point of view. And what I want to highlight is how this diverges from the Marxist understanding of a concept or of an institution like slavery. And once again here, I guess we should distinguish between slavery as the actual institution itself and slavery as the concept about the institution. I have no dispute with the idea that how we understand slavery is very much an idea that is constructed and that changes throughout history. But I would say that the Orthodox Marxist understanding of an institution like slavery is that it wasn't really socially constructed or wasn't really a choice freely made by humans, individuals at a previous time. Instead, Marxism would say that there is something inevitable or essential about slavery to a particular stage of human development, given a particular stage in our technological development and the development of our productivity of human labor, that it is more or less inevitable or functional that slavery will continually arise time after time again, even in isolated, human societies. We see this institution crop up time and time again. So it's not like the idea of slavery is just spreading and people are electing um, to set up this institution because of how swell they, how great they like the idea. So they are choosing to socially construct it as an institution. Marxism would very much dispute that. Instead, what Marxism would say is that in a particular historical context, at a particular stage of development, at a particular level of technology and material conditions, which could include things like climate or what food crops are available, things of that sort. Slavery becomes functional or effective. And by that, it does not necessarily mean that it is moral or pleasing to all individuals in that society. Obviously, it's not pleasing or pleasant for all individuals in that society. Instead, what the claim would be from a Marxist standpoint is that those societies are effective in the sense that they subdue or conquer other societies that are not practicing the institution in that context. That they will, for example, you might have a neighboring hunter-gatherer tribe that is much more equal, probably much more pleasant to live in, but that will nonetheless get conquered by a slave-owning society. Because the slave-owning society is able to concentrate a surplus and hire a professional gang of armed men, usually, to enforce the will of that society's ruling class, and they will conquer the neighboring hunter-gatherer society. All of this would, in a moral sense, if you want to make the moral judgment, is actually quite unfortunate. But general Marxists tend to not be too interested in making the moral judgments. They just say, what is functional or what is effective, what's inevitable at that stage in human development. And they would say it's inevitable that slave-owning societies will gradually take power. They will gradually conquer neighboring societies that don't embrace slavery, that remain more equal. It sucks, but that seems to be time and time again what happens. And so obviously the difference between Marxism and someone like Aristotle is Aristotle would project this forward into, as a prediction about how human society would eternally be, that slavery would be everlasting. Marxism would say, no, in that context it's functional or more effective at perpetuating that society and its power, but it might not be if technology further evolves or if the other material conditions evolve. Then people might have to adapt. If suddenly the world gets plunged into an ice age and you can't grow crops, maybe you do have to revert back to hunter-gatherer way of life. Or, if you get a hold of, if you can, manage to invent the steam engine and you have the economic incentive to economize on slave labor for some reason, or if various things that could happen to kind of incentivize your society to move away from slavery towards, for example, wage labor. Where wage labor will end up being more efficient, more functional, more effective of a way of organizing society. And once again, we don't mean in terms of a moral judgment, in terms of capitalism being more pleasant necessarily than a slave-based society, although coincidentally it probably is for most people. But in terms of which society is more effective at perpetuating itself, at extending its rule, at making other parts of the world into its own image, as Marx famously said in the manifesto. As he said, capitalism does over, other societies that are in these earlier, objectively less effective stages of human development, given a certain level of technology. Given the steam engine, it will be harnessed or utilized, less effectively by a slave-owning class than by a capitalist class. That's a sort of Marxist claim that you wouldn't find under being made by social constructionists. Um, so uh, in a sense, Marxists do tend to be essentialists, um, but in a contextual sense, in a historically contextual sense, that this sort of thing inevitably kind of has to happen in a certain context. Not that it will be eternal, but in a certain stage, yes, this has to happen. So, for example, Marxists would make the prediction that if we find, intelligent life on another planet, if they're social beings like us, odds are, yes, they probably also had to move through a slave stage, slave society in their development. They also probably used the law of value, had a stage in their society's development where they utilize the law of value to organize themselves, just because that happens to be most functional way of harnessing certain technologies. Um, so that kind of gives you a feeling for some of the divergence. Another way in which Marxism and like pure social constructionism would diverge is over uh, conflict between groups. So I think social constructionism in its purest form would portray conflict arising between groups or individuals as being entirely due to those individuals wanting to pick a fight, or those individuals freely choosing to construct their identities as being opposed to each other. That, oh, I'm a worker and you're a capitalist. And because I identify myself as a worker and identify you as the enemy, then that makes it so that we have to fight. And theoretically, if I chose not to identify myself as a worker and instead identified with you as a fellow human being, then we wouldn't have to fight, or we wouldn't have to, at the very least, struggle against each other's interests. And I think Marxism does hold that view when applied to certain categories like race or nation. Marxism would say that those group categories are socially constructed, that we don't have to fight against each other on the basis of those divisions, because those divisions are self-made. They're just because we have selected to identify with this nation or whatever and fight people of this other nation. But Marxism has a caveat or makes an exception for class. Class, according to Marxism, is an objective economic category, in the sense that class divisions and differences in class interests, irreconcilable differences in class interest, persist even if each side of the equation, wage worker and employer, even if they don't want to fight each other, or even if they don't even have any concept that they're a part of a different group, even if they think that they're all on the same team, even if they pledge to be on the same team and not fight against each other. According to Marxism, the law of value, this objective economic law that currently reigns, that's outside of anyone's control, that's not really socially constructed. No one really chose to set up society in this way. This is kind of the functional requirement for society to pass through at this stage. This mandates that employers have to, economize on their wage labor bills. They have to try to pay workers the least amount possible, and wage workers have the unavoidable incentive to try to get the most for their, labor power that they can. Try to get the highest wages. So you've got this unavoidable conflict that will persist and rage on regardless of how the two groups feel about each other, regardless of how they construct their identities subjectively, how they think about themselves. They'll still feel these pressures to combat each other's interests. There'll still be these objective economic pressures that force them into these situations of friction with each other, where they find themselves fighting for different things. And really, the only way I can think of that you could get around this is if, like, let's say you had a world government that had both the intention and the capability of enforcing, like, a universal worldwide minimum wage law, or universal, worldwide, set wage. And it said, okay, we're not going to tolerate conflict over this thing. We're, going to enforce this with an iron fist. Employers and workers have nothing left to struggle over because the decision is settled over how much workers are going to make. So any further conflict is a needless choice to engage in conflict for its own sake. It's any further conflict is a social construction. It's a freely, given choice, and, there's no reason for us to tolerate that choice. We're going to imprison people who agitate against the opposite class or agitate to change this law to benefit one side or the other. Which theoretically you could do that, except you'd have to posit a sort of government that somehow stands outside of all of class society as sort of like this unmoved mover, like a godlike force that is free to impose rules on society without itself being constrained by the need for resources, by the need to raise money, raise loans, collect taxes, all of which these sorts of things depend on the goodwill of the class in society that owns most of the property, the capitalist class in our case. So that's really not a realistic, scenario. So even in that sense, Marxists would predict that class conflict will be inevitable, as long as the law of value persists. So I just wanted to highlight that interesting divergence between Marxism and, in this case, the concept of social constructionism. Certainly, like, take slave-owning society, for example, to go back to that one last time. I do think that at a certain stage of development, Marxists would say that slavery, like, let's say, leading up to the Civil War in America, that slavery was being socially constructed, or I should say socially retained, socially reinforced, because at that point in human society, slavery actually no longer was objectively the most efficient way to organize American society. It was no longer the most effective way to make America an effective power in the world. And so, because slavery was past its sell-by date, so to speak, the only thing propping it up at that point was the social constructionism of its apologists and defenders like George Fitzhugh. So certainly Marxism would allow a place for the role of social constructionism, but not as much of an application. It would more tightly constrain how widely we can apply this concept, because once again, Marxism has these grand meta-narratives that Jordan Peterson just completely has, he's missed out on this huge divergence, between Marxism and Post-Modernism. And so, Marxism does make these objective claims about how things have to be, more or less, at certain stages in development. These claims aren't eternal, but they are, objective for that context. And so, that's a big divergence. And, for example, looking back at the Soviet Union, we would have to conclude, since it fell apart, that in that case, the attempt at socialism was socially constructed. It was not inevitable. It was not strictly necessary, because it failed. It fell apart. If it had not failed, if it had gradually taken over the rest of the world, for good or positive, morally or subjectively, however we want to say whether that would have been good for humanity or not, if it was objectively effective in taking over the rest of the world, or making the rest of the world into its own image, then we would have had to conclude that at that stage of historical development, socialism / communism, I won't get into the terminology there, but that what the Soviet Union was doing, whatever that was, that was historically necessary at that point, that it was inevitable, Um, and that's not to say that that necessarily means that that's the end of history, that that is going to be the eternal way things are going to be from then on. Marx famously said that he predicted that transition from capitalism into eventually communism would be the end of human history as we know it and the start of real human history. So, you know, human society was probably not going to be perfectly stagnant and eternal and unchanging at that point. But how it would evolve past that point would be hard for us to predict, really. We can't see that far ahead. Maybe we would invent artificial intelligence that would rise up as the new proletariat and, overthrow, or perhaps we would move in an entirely orthogonal direction and all become beings of pure light and energy. Who knows what. But it would be the end of the class struggle among humans as we know it. Different. Our society would evolve along in different ways from that point forward. Was Marx's prediction. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight those differences. I'm not really claiming in this video that Marxism or social constructionism are more or less valid than one another. That's up. I mean, obviously, you can probably tell I would go to bat for the Marxist view of things personally, but that's kind of beside the purpose of this video. This is just to kind of illustrate the divergence as I see it, and also to reinforce the point once again that Jordan Peterson has no clue what he's talking about if he's at all trying to draw any sort of historical continuity between Marxism and these postmodern ideas like social constructionism, because they're really, you can't get any more different, really. They only look similar if you get hung up on the coincidence that both, I guess, Marxism and postmodernism are skeptical about traditional Western values, right? And only because Jordan Peterson, that's all he can fixate on because he's so obsessed with safeguarding what he sees as traditional Western values. So all the other distinctions kind of blur, out of his field of vision. That's all he can see. I think that's where he's coming from, if I had to guess, because otherwise I don't see how you miss these huge distinctions between Marxism and postmodern ideas such as social constructionism. All right, hope that was informative. Please leave your comments, and I'll see you later.